Meyer Lansky was never the loudest gangster in the room. He didn't chase headlines, he didn't need to. While men like Capone built empires with blood and bravado, Lansky built one with math, memory, and absolute emotional control. He was the mob's accountant, its strategist, its long game, the man who figured out how to turn crime into a system that could survive prison, politics, and time itself. He rarely pulled a trigger, but he decided who could afford to. Lansky understood something the others didn't. Violence is expensive, money is power, and power lasts longer when no one can prove it's yours. This isn't the story of a flashy killer or a street thug. This is the story of the man who made organized crime organized and walked away while everyone else burned. This is Meyer Lansky. And you're listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. Let's get into it. Meyer Lansky was born Meyer Sucholjansky in 1902 in Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire, a place where being Jewish meant living with routine violence, state-sanctioned anti-Semitism, and the constant threat of pogroms. His family didn't leave for opportunity. They left for survival. When they arrived in New York City in 1911, they settled on the Lower East Side, a neighborhood packed with immigrants, sweatshops, gangs of teenage boys, and a daily lesson in who had power and who didn't. Lansky was small, sickly, and not built for street fights. What he had instead was a sharp memory, a head for numbers, and an early understanding that brute force was a losing strategy for someone like him. As a teenager, Lansky gravitated toward gambling, dice games, card tables, anything where odds could be calculated and money moved quietly from one pocket to another. He learned to read people the same way he read numbers, noticing who bluffed, who panicked, and who could be trusted to keep their mouth shut. Around the same time, another immigrant kid was coming up on those same streets, Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was the opposite of Lansky. Taller, violent, socially dominant, and willing to use intimidation when it worked. Where Lansky saw patterns, Luciano saw people. Where Lansky avoided fights, Luciano leaned into them. Their partnership formed not out of friendship, but out of usefulness. Lansky needed protection and access. Luciano needed money, planning, and someone who could think past the next score. Together, they represented a new kind of criminal alliance, not divided by old-world ethnic lines, but built on efficiency and profit. That relationship, forged in the chaos of the Lower East Side, would quietly reshape American organized crime for decades to come. Their first real meeting wasn't some legendary gangster moment. It was street-level and awkward, like most things that actually matter. According to Lansky's own accounts, a young Charles Lucky Luciano tried to shake him down on the Lower East Side. Standard operating procedure back then, pay up or else. Lansky said no, not because he was tough, he wasn't. He said no because the math didn't work and because once you start paying, you never stop. What's interesting is that Luciano didn't just knock him around and move on. He stopped. He listened. Lansky didn't posture or plead. He explained. He talked about gambling, about odds, about how protection money eats profit and creates dependency. Basically, he treated the situation like a bad business proposal. Luciano, who was violent when it suited him, clocked that immediately. This kid wasn't fearless. He was precise, and that was rarer. So the shakedown quietly turned into a conversation, and the conversation turned into a working relationship. No loyalty speeches, no brotherhood nonsense. Just mutual recognition. Lansky could make money behave, and Luciano could make people behave. That first encounter didn't create a bond. It created a division of labor. And once they figured that out, the old rules of the mob were already on borrowed time. When they first crossed paths on the Lower East Side, Lucky Luciano was about 18 years old, already running with Italian street gangs and doing small-time extortion. Meyer Lansky was roughly 15, still a skinny Jewish kid making money off dice games and cards. So this wasn't two seasoned mob bosses sizing each other up. It was a teenage thug trying to shake down a teenage math nerd and realizing mid-interaction that the nerd was thinking 3 moves ahead. That age gap matters because it explains the dynamic from day one. Luciano had the muscle early, Lansky had the brain early, and somehow they both recognized it before either one was legally an adult. Their first real collaborations weren't glamorous. No big scores, no headlines, just low-level gambling and protection on the Lower East Side, when both of them were still basically kids. Lansky was running dice games in small card rooms. Luciano brought muscle, but more importantly, he brought order, not random violence, targeted pressure, enough to keep games running and people paying without drawing heat. What mattered wasn't the crime itself, it was the method. Instead of fighting over territory like every other street crew, they worked the same blocks together. Jewish and Italian gangs cooperating wasn't normal, it wasn't tradition, and it was practical. If a game made money, they kept it. If it didn't, Lansky shut it down. If someone got noisy or greedy, Luciano handled it. Clean, efficient, minimal mess. This is where you start seeing the blueprint. Lansky handled numbers and risk. Luciano handled people and enforcement. Nobody pretended it was loyalty or brotherhood. It was division of labor. And while everyone else was still playing gangster dress up, these two were already treating crime like a business that needed to survive police, rivals, and time. That mindset, more than any bootlegging fortune, is what changed everything. This is where Lansky and Luciano really diverge. Lucky had bosses, real ones, men he had to answer to, fear, and eventually eliminate. First Joe Masseria, then Maranzano. That whole Sicilian hierarchy came with rules, loyalty tests, and the understanding that if you waited too long, you'd end up dead anyway. Lansky didn't have that problem. He didn't come up through a formal chain of command because there wasn't one. Jewish organized crime on the Lower East Side wasn't built like the mafia. No capos, no ceremonies, no Godfather nonsense. Lansky operated through partnerships. If someone stopped being useful, the relationship ended. No coup required. That structure, or lack of one, is why Lansky survived. He didn't need to kill a boss to move up. He didn't need to defend a title. He could advise Luciano, bankroll operations, or quietly step back when things got messy. Even at the height of Luciano's power, Lansky wasn't underneath him. He was adjacent, the guy you listened to if you wanted the money to keep flowing and the heat to stay manageable. So when people ask why Lucky went to prison and Lansky didn't, this is the answer. One man climbed a hierarchy that demanded blood. The other built a position that didn't require it. Lansky didn't hit it big with one score. He scaled, slowly, deliberately. And he did it by positioning himself between the violence and the money, not at the front of either. His real breakthrough came in the early 1920s when he locked down gambling operations that were steady, boring, and hard to prosecute. Dice, cards, and early bookmaking, and then tied them to people who could protect them without running them into the ground. He learned from Rothstein how to insulate money, how to use fronts, and how to keep his name off anything that bled. While other guys were chasing flashy robberies or headline murders, Lansky was building cash flow. Then Prohibition hit in 1920 and everyone else lost their minds. Lansky didn't. He let Luciano and the street crews fight over booze routes while he handled financing, accounting, and logistics. And he bankrolled operations, skimmed quietly, and made sure money moved through layers, businesses, casinos, racetracks, anything that looked legitimate enough to survive a subpoena. This is where he stopped being a gambler and became infrastructure. But the real leap came after 1931, once Luciano helped dismantle the old mafia bosses and reorganize the system. Lansky wasn't promoted. He was already indispensable. He became the guy who could be trusted with syndicate money, Cuba, Florida, Vegas, offshore gambling before anyone called it that. He didn't need to be in charge of crews because he controlled the cash that kept them alive. So Lansky didn't hit it big by taking over territory or ordering hits. He hit it big by doing the thing no one else wanted to do: math, patience, and staying alive. By the time people realized how powerful he was, there was nothing obvious to take away. No title, no throne, just money moving in ways that were very hard to stop. Meanwhile, Lansky wasn't operating in a vacuum. This is where Bugsy Siegel enters the picture. Loud, volatile, and absolutely the opposite of Lansky in every way that matters. They met as teenagers on the Lower East Side, where Siegel was already known for being impulsive and violent, and Lansky was known for being smart and cautious. Together, they formed what later got labeled the Bugs Meyer Gang, which sounds cooler than it actually was. It was basically Lansky running the numbers and Bugsy making sure nobody got brave. Bugsy's reputation traveled faster than his judgment, which is how he crossed paths with Lucky Luciano. Luciano didn't meet Bugsy because he liked him. He met him because Bugsy was useful. He was fearless, unpredictable, and willing to do things that smarter men preferred not to be directly connected to. Luciano folded Bugsy into the same broader network he was building with Lansky, using each of them for what they were good at. Lansky became the planner. Bugsy became the muscle. Lucky sat in the middle, coordinating chaos. And for a while, it worked. Bugsy handled enforcement and intimidation, while Lansky stayed insulated, and Luciano leveraged both of them to expand beyond old-school ethnic silos. But the imbalance was always there. Bugsy lived fast and burned money. Lansky watched everything and remembered who cost more than they returned. That tension didn't explode right away. It just sat there, quietly, waiting for Las Vegas to make it unavoidable. Because Bugsy was dangerous, and Lansky knew exactly how to use that without becoming it. Lansky kept Bugsy close for the same reason corporations keep volatile but effective operators on the payroll. When Bugsy worked, he worked hard. He was fearless, loyal to Lansky personally, and willing to take risks Lansky never would. In the early years, that made him invaluable. Bugsy could intimidate rivals, enforce debts, and handle situations where calm negotiation wasn't an option. Lansky didn't have to get his hands dirty. Bugsy was the buffer. There was also control and proximity. Keeping Bugsy inside the circle meant he was predictable. Pushing him out would have been reckless. Bugsy with no oversight was worse than Bugsy under supervision. Lansky understood that unmanaged volatility creates problems, but managed volatility can be weaponized. As long as Bugsy was producing more than he was costing, Lansky tolerated the chaos. The problem was that Bugsy didn't evolve. As the money got bigger, his impulse control didn't. He overspent, ignored warnings, and treated investor money like a suggestion. Once the flamingo started hemorrhaging cash, the math flipped. Bugsy stopped being a shield and became a risk, not just financially, but politically. At that point, keeping him close wasn't loyalty anymore, it was exposure. And that's where Lansky drew the line. He didn't need to betray Bugsy. He just stopped protecting him. In that world, that was enough. So here's the question nobody likes to ask, because it ruins the gangster mythology. Is Meyer Lansky actually worse than the killers? He didn't pull triggers. He didn't spray bullets in restaurants or bleed out in the street. He just made sure someone else did the dirty work, and then made money whether they lived or died. And the easiest way to understand Lansky isn't by staring at him. It's by watching the men he outlived. Bugsy showed him exactly what happens when impulse outruns control. The old bosses collapsed under tradition and ego. The new ones collapsed under visibility. Lansky watched all of it, adjusted, and kept moving. Every time the system broke, he didn't mourn it. He rewired himself around the wreckage. That's why he sounds boring if you tell his story the wrong way. Lansky didn't lose because he didn't play the same game. He won the future. What he built looks a lot less like a mob crew and a lot more like modern crime. Shell companies, offshore money, plausible deniability, and a long paper trail that never quite leads anywhere useful. No violence on the record, no fingerprints on the weapon, just profit. The CEO, who didn't know, executives who weren't involved. Sound familiar? Street violence didn't survive this century. Paperwork did. Lansky didn't fail to become a legend, he outgrew the need to be one. And that's the uncomfortable truth most shows won't touch. The scariest criminals aren't the ones who explode. They're the ones who adapt, insulate, and walk away while everyone else burns. That's not just a mob story, that's an American one. So here's the question I keep coming back to, and it's uncomfortable on purpose. Is Meyer Lansky actually worse than the killers? He didn't pull triggers, he didn't get his hands bloody, he just made sure someone else did and took his cut either way. That distance is the whole point. Bugsy died in a living room full of gunfire. Lucky died in exile, powerless and forgotten. Rothstein bled out on a hotel floor. Lansky watched all of it and kept cashing checks. That's not restraint. That's insulation. He figured out early that violence is noisy, emotional, and expensive. Paperwork is quiet. Delegation works. And if you build things right, nobody can ever quite prove what you did. So while everyone else paid for their crimes with bullets or prison, Lansky paid with lawyers and accountants. And even then, barely. So yeah, ask yourself which one is worse. The guy who kills and gets punished, or the guy who never pulls the trigger, never goes down, and lives long enough to die in bed arguing with the IRS. If that feels less dramatic, good. That's the point. If you really want to understand Meyer Lansky, don't look at him head on. Watch the men around him and what happened to them. Start with Arnold Rothstein. It was Rothstein who taught him the first real lesson. Crime works better when it looks boring. Money moves quietly. Risk should belong to someone else. Rothstein thought he was untouchable until he wasn't. Shot, bleeding out, refusing to name names. Lansky learned from that ending and filed it away. Then there's Lucky Luciano. Brilliant, ruthless, and still trapped in a system that demanded blood. Luciano modernized the mob, broke the old hierarchies, and still ended up paying for it with prison and exile. Power, apparently, has a shelf life if your name is on it. Lansky stayed close enough to advise, far enough to survive. Bugsy Siegel is the cautionary tale Lansky never needed to experience himself. Charismatic, volatile, allergic to limits. Bugsy lived fast, spent faster, and confused loyalty with entitlement. When the Flamingo became a financial embarrassment instead of a success, Bugsy's personality stopped being charming and started being dangerous. He died loudly. Lansky took notes. The old bosses, Masseria, Maranzano, the entire generation that thought tradition was protection, collapsed under their own rigidity. They believed structure made them safe. It made them visible. Lansky watched them get replaced not because they were weak, but because they refused to adapt. And then there's the version of the mob that doesn't wear suits or carry guns anymore. The corporate kind, shell companies, offshore accounts, executives who didn't know, boards that never ask questions. That world looks a lot more like Lansky's blueprint than anyone likes to admit. He didn't disappear. His methods just became legal adjacent. That's the pattern. Everyone else explodes or fades out. Lansky adjusts over and over. And that repetition tells you everything you need to know about who really won. This is where people always want a clean answer, and there isn't one. There's no documented hit you can pin on Meyer Lansky. No wiretap, no witness, no court record. And that's not a gap in the history. That is the history. Lansky didn't operate in ways that left that kind of trail. But if we're talking about responsibility instead of proof, one name keeps floating to the surface: Bugsy Siegel. Bugsy's murder in 1947 wasn't random, and it wasn't personal. It was business. The Flamingo was bleeding money, investors were panicking, and Bugsy wasn't listening to anyone anymore. Lansky was his closest partner. He had the most money tied up in the project and the most credibility with the syndicate. There's no evidence Lansky ordered the hit, and anyone who says otherwise is filling in blanks. But there's also no serious argument that it happened over his objection. If Lansky wanted Bugsy protected, Bugsy would have been protected, and that's the part people struggle with. Lansky didn't have to say anything. He didn't need to plan it or approve it out loud. He just stopped shielding Bugsy once the math stopped working. In that world, silence wasn't neutrality, it was permission. Beyond that, the record gets thin fast. He didn't run Murder, Inc. He didn't direct the Castellamarese War. Those were Luciano's worlds. Lansky stayed where he always did, close enough to benefit, far enough to survive. So if you're looking for a body count with his name on it, you won't find one. What you'll find instead is something harder to sit with. A man who built a career where not stopping a killing was enough, and where responsibility never had to be spoken out loud. Bugsy wasn't some one-off exception. He was just the most obvious version of a pattern Lansky used over and over. There's no evidence Lansky ever sat anyone down and said, "Go kill this person." That's not how he operated. He didn't give orders like that because he didn't need to. He put the right people in the room and let outcomes take care of themselves. Early on, Lansky aligned himself with men whose job was enforcement, debt collectors, intimidators, guys everyone already knew you didn't cross. He didn't command them. He funded them, partnered with them, and made sure they were positioned where problems had predictable endings. If a gambling operation was threatened or someone stopped paying, Lansky didn't have to spell out consequences. The people around him already understood what handling it meant. Later, when Luciano built out the larger syndicate structure, Lansky benefited from violence he didn't control and didn't direct. Murder, Inc. wasn't his operation. Lepka and Anastasia ran that world. Luciano used it. Lansky stayed adjacent. Close enough that his interests were protected. Far enough that his name never surfaced. Same setup, different scale. That's the link to Lansky. He didn't outsource violence because he was weak. He did it because it worked. Distance wasn't an accident. It was the strategy. Bugsy just made it visible because he was loud, reckless, and eventually impossible to protect. Everyone else was quieter, more interchangeable, and easier to keep at arm's length. So when you look at Lansky's story, don't look for a hit list. Look for a pattern. Violence happened around him for him and because of the systems he helped build, and he never had to say a word. This is where a lot of shows get lazy and just slap the word psychopath on him and move on, and it doesn't fit. Meyer Lansky doesn't look like a classic psychopath at all. No impulsive violence, no public explosions, no need to dominate rooms or prove anything. He wasn't chasing adrenaline or attention. If anything, he actively avoided both. Lansky wasn't reckless. He was controlled, almost aggressively so. He didn't lash out. He calculated. That alone puts him outside the usual mob psychology we're used to. Most of the men around him were reactive, ego-driven, emotionally volatile. Lansky wasn't any of that. He didn't spiral. He waited. What he does show is something quieter and, honestly, more unsettling. Callous pragmatism. People weren't people. They were variables. Problems weren't emotional conflicts. They were inefficiencies. If removing someone solved a problem and didn't expose him, it was acceptable. Not exciting, not personal, just clean. And here's the key distinction. Lansky had cognitive empathy without emotional empathy. He could read people extremely well. He understood fear, loyalty, ego, and weakness, not because he felt it with them, but because he studied it. That made him effective without making him emotionally involved. He didn't enjoy harm. He just didn't register it as something that needed to stop him. Layered on top of that was high strategic calculation and a flat emotional presentation. Low affect. No dramatic highs or lows. No visible guilt. No visible pleasure either. He didn't need validation. He needed outcomes. That combination is why he doesn't feel cinematic and why he's actually dangerous in a way most gangsters aren't. So if you're looking for a monster, Lansky's gonna disappoint you. If you're looking for a warning sign, you shouldn't, because this isn't the psychology of a street killer. It's the psychology of someone who figures out how to cause harm without ever appearing to be the source of it. Yeah, it makes him more dangerous, not less, and not in a flashy way, in a long term, quietly destructive way. The impulsive guys burn out, they get sloppy, they explode, draw attention, rack up enemies, and eventually someone shoots them or locks them up. That kind of danger is loud and short lived. Lansky's wasn't. What made him dangerous was the control. He wasn't acting out of rage or ego. He didn't need the rush. He didn't escalate emotionally. He just waited. And when harm was useful, it became procedural, not dramatic, not personal, just another step in the process. That kind of detachment lasts. When someone can understand fear and suffering without feeling responsible for it, they don't hesitate, and they don't unravel afterward. Violence becomes abstract. Distance becomes protection. And because they stay calm, people underestimate them. And that's why Lansky outlived the killers. Not because he was kinder, because he didn't self destruct. He let other people do that part for him and kept going. There's no real number you can put on it, and anyone who gives you one is lying. Lansky didn't operate in a way that produces a clean body count. That's kind of the whole point. He wasn't pulling triggers, he wasn't running hit crews, and he wasn't keeping score. He built environments where violence was an acceptable solution and then made sure he was never the one delivering it. So if we're guessing, and we are guessing, you're not talking about hundreds with his name attached the way you would with a shooter or an enforcer, but you're also not talking about zero. Over decades of gambling, bootlegging, enforcement, power struggles, and syndicate cleanup, people were killed in ways that clearly protected Lansky's interests or made his life easier afterward. Probably dozens, not single digits. And here's the part that matters. He didn't need to know every name. He didn't need to approve every act. He just needed to keep working inside systems where violence was already baked in and never be the person who stopped it. Silence did the work, distance did the rest. So, no, there's no number. What there is a pattern. A man who spent his entire career adjacent to lethal outcomes, benefited from them, and never paid for them directly. That's not innocence, that's insulation. And honestly, that should bother you more than a tally ever could. Meyer Lansky didn't run the mob. He didn't need to. He figured out how to exist inside it without ever being crushed by it. The killers died loud, the bosses fell hard, the system survived, and Lansky lived long enough to watch all of it happen. If that feels anticlimactic, great. That's the real ending. Because the most dangerous people aren't the ones who lose control. They're the ones who never do. You've been listening to Deadly Truths with Becca. If this episode made you uncomfortable, good. That's usually where the truth lives. If you want more stories like this, the ones that don't mythologize violence or sanitize power, follow, rate, and share the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. It actually helps more than you think. Sources for this episode include historical court records, FBI files, contemporaneous reporting, and established mob histories. As always, this show is researched, written, and produced independently. And remember, the past isn't dead. It's just being forged in the murder factory.